Do you always struggle and have a hard time when you have an error in your JavaScript file? Does any of these stuff look familiar to you? If they don't, then don't worry, because by the end of this video you will be able to debug any JavaScript issue that you have, and it's a lot easier than you think. Now, I know that debugging can be frustrating sometimes, but you need to take your time and learn the tricks. In this video, we will cover the sources panel of the Chrome developer tools and the ways that you can easily debug your JavaScript code. As you might remember from the previous video, we talked about how you can see the DOM of your page and the list of the elements in the Elements panel and how you can view and edit CSS. We also talked about how you can run JavaScript from the console panel and how you can debug your code from this panel. We continue with debugging JavaScript, and we now go to the sources tab because this page helps us a lot in debugging JavaScript. As the name of this panel says, we can view the sources of our website. In the left side section, we can see the files that our website loads. And if we open a file, we can see it here. And we can also debug our script in this section. I just made it a little bit smaller so we can see it. We can create some breakpoints in our website and then debug our code. We will explain this better. Here in the left section, I can see all the JavaScript and CSS files that are loaded in this page. There might be other JavaScript and CSS files on my website as well, but I only see the ones that are loaded in this page. I can also see fonts as well. I don't see any backend files in this section. So if my website uses Python or PHP or any other language, for the backend, I don't see it here. I only see the files that are rendered by the browser. Most of the websites nowadays minify and bundle JavaScript files, but the version of the JavaScript file that you see in the sources panel might not be minified and bundled because they use a source map file. And the version that sources panel shows you and the Chrome developer shows you is a cleaner version and a more understandable version. That's because of the source map file they use. One thing that you can do in the file section is to change the JavaScript file and add a code to it or change the code. But remember, the only changes that you make in the functions will be affected in the page. So for example, if you add any code outside of a function, then it'll not happen on the page. But if you change something in a function, it'll take effect. One other cool thing that you can do in the sources panel is to use snippets. The snippets are just codes that you want to reuse on another website. So instead of writing it each time on the console panel, you would add it to a snippet and would just run it on the website that you want. A good example of this is a code that I use for the websites that don't have dark mode. I use this code and kind of revert the colors and make the background a little bit darker, so it is kind of a dark mode for me. The website that don't have dark mode, I add this code, but it's hard for me to write the code each time on the console panel. So instead, it would be easier for me if I add it as a snippet and just run it. To add a snippet, I would go to the snippet section here and would paste my code. This is a code that I have written for this purpose and would give this a name like dark mode. Now, in order to run this, I can either come to this section and right click on it and just press run and it will revert the colors for me. Or I can go to the command section with Control-Shift-P or another shortcode that you use on your browser. I delete the latest character, exclamation, and the name of the snippet. Then it will be applied to the page. So let's try this on another web page. Now I'm on the Microsoft News website and I want to apply this snippet that I have written. So I'll just apply this snippet and it will quickly turn this website into a dark mode for me. Think of the other codes that you can use as snippet, the codes that you have to rewrite each time on the console tab. These can be snippets. If I rerun the page, all my changes will be gone. To show the debugging modes better, I have created a simple product order form that has 3 products and a price for each product, and you would enter the quantity and it will calculate the price. It is a simple JavaScript code and it doesn't do anything special, just it will calculate the price. If I enter a quantity for each one of these products and hit the calculate total, it'll show me a price of $49 and it will console.log some information that might be useful for me. This is the code for our script. We have the product prices in an object, and in the code, we will loop through the products and their quantities and will calculate the price and add it to the total price of the products. And at the end, we will just add it to the page. The logs that we have in this file can be useful, but they are only useful if we know where to look for the errors and the values. If we don't know what we're looking for and we don't have a clue where the error is happening, it might not be really useful. And in other cases, we don't have access to the source file to add this console.log. And it is more useful to us to just debug it in the sources panel. I will show you how. First, let's see how we would add a console.log to the JavaScript file when we don't have access to the source code. Because we can't just simply add a console.log here to have an information of the product prices. And that is because the browser won't load the JavaScript file again once it's initially loaded. So whatever changes we make here won't take effect unless it's in a function and we somehow run the function again by triggering something in the page. In order to do this, we can do some cool things. Open the file that you want to edit on the sources panel, and on the line that you want to log something, right-click on the line that you want to add a log and select Add Log Point. At this box, you should just write this statement that you want to log. So this would be your console.log statement, but without the console.log. For example, here, I can only write total price. And this will log my total price. Now, if I do something in this form, change the quantities, and calculate the total, I would log some information about my total price. That is because that we have added this log after the initial call of the click. So still the total price is 0. Let's add another log here that would console.log our price. So I would another log and price. And I want to delete this log point. Okay. Now if I go to the console panel, change the quantities again, and calculate the total, I would get the price step by step. So at the first step it's 0, at the second one it's 10, and then it is 55. The first step is for the first product, and in the next step, we have the price of the first product added by the price of the product B. Now I remove the log point, and what I want to do is to add a breakpoint. Breakpoints are the points in your code that you want the process to be stopped and the source panel to print every information that we have so far from the script. If I add a breakpoint on this line, for example, the total price calculation, I would right click and select Add Breakpoint. Now my code would be stopped whenever it reaches this point. In order to show this to you, I would just make some changes to the page and would hit Calculate Total. So as you can see, my page says that it's paused in debugger, and I have a lot of useful information here. Let's close this panel because we don't need it anymore, and let's make this a little bit bigger. In the file, you can see the result of the calculation or the assignment in front of the line. For example, here we have the total price of 0, and on the next lines we can see that we have assigned values to the product IDs and price and quantity input. On the right panel, we have the values for the variables that we have so far in their different scope. And we also have other types of breakpoints that we will get to later. Now I can go some steps forward to see what is happening in the code after this step. So I would just press this step over. And now I can see that the value of the variables are changing. And then again, after the next function call, this would be the amount of variables. And then we're going inside the function. And you can examine the value of the variables to see if there is any issues on your code. This is really useful when you want to know what is happening in the code and how the values are changing. Now, if I click on step out of the current function, I will be in the last line of this function where all the things has happened. And then I will be again at the last step of the function. So here we have three options: step over, step in, and step out of the current functions. These are really different when you have a function and you're not in the function yet. So if you press step over, it'll show you the result after the function has been executed. And if you press on step into, you will go inside the function and you will see the process inside the function. And if you click on the step out of the current function, you have basically seen all the things that you need and you don't want to be in the function anymore. So if you click on this, you'll be out of the function again. In our case here, this is not really that much different because we are already inside the function. So our breakpoint is already inside the function and it doesn't matter that much. Now let's see what other kind of breakpoints we can set. If I know what events are triggering in my code, it would be easy for me to set some event listener breakpoints. In our code, I can see that I have set up an event listener for click, and whenever a click event is happening, I'm running this code. So in our sources panel, I can set up a breakpoint for this event listener. If I open this and under the mouse events, I can select click. So don't forget to remove this breakpoint that you have set up in the code. And now whenever you click on this page, the process will be stopped. Okay. Now I want to change these quantities and click on this calculate total. And as you can see, it is telling me that the page has stopped because I have clicked. And there is more information on this event listener because I have clicked on a button. And now I can see the value of the variables. And most of them are not set yet. So I can go to the next step and can see that my total price has been set to 0. And if I step over this function, I would see it after it has been executed. Now I can see that the value of I is 0, and then again after the next call I will see the variables. Now let's click on this again to see the variables, and under this watch section, no matter what I'm debugging and what kind of breakpoints I have, I can always set some variables to watch. For example, I always want to see the value for total price and also the value for product IDs. So no matter what I'm debugging on the page, whenever this debugger has stopped the page, I will see the values for these two. So let's see what happens when I go to the next step of the code. I can see that while I still have these values here, I can watch them also here. This is useful when you have a lot of variables and you only want to watch some specific variables. There are times that you don't know what event is attached to an element on the page. To use it on this event listener breakpoints, there's a cool way on the Chrome developer tools to find out the events that are attached to a DOM. In order to find this out, you need to go to the Elements panel and inspect the element that you want to see the events for. So for example, we want to see what event listeners are attached to this calculate total button. So we inspect it, and on the right section, we go to the event listeners. Now, I can see that I have set up an event listener for click event, and I also can see the callback function for it in the sources panel. If I want to see what event listeners are attached to its parents elements, then I can also enable the ancestors, and I will see all the events that are attached to its parents as well. On bigger sites, there might be a huge list of events attached to each element. Now that you know the name of the event that is attached to this button element, you can use it in the sources panel to pause the code if there is any issues with this button or the process that this button is triggering. There are some other occasions when you don't know what event is exactly triggering on the page, but you still want to debug the process. In this case, when you don't have an idea of the events on the page, you can set the DOM mutation breakpoints. In our case, I will delete the click breakpoint that I have set. And if I change the values here, I can see that whenever I calculate the total price, the DOM here gets changed. So this is a good clue for me to set up a breakpoint here. If I have a problem in my calculate process, then I can debug the issues here. So besides setting up breakpoints in the JavaScript file and setting up breakpoints when an event is happening, I can also set breakpoints in the Elements panel. I would inspect this part of my code, and I would right click on it and would select break on subtree modification, because this is equivalent to changing. Okay, now when I change the values, I will go to the sources panel. When I change some values here and click on calculate total, I can see that my code has been paused on subtree modification, and specifically this DOM. I can also see the variables that I have set in the watch section. And also here, I can see the value for these variables. Then when I go to the next lines, I can see the process of changing the values for these variables and the last total price, that is 71. Okay. In the list of the event listener breakpoints, if you take a look at them, you can see that you have a lot of event listener breakpoints that you can select. And this really depends on if you know what event is triggering on your page or not. However, if you're not sure, you can always select the DOM and subtree modification breakpoints. Now let's remove this DOM breakpoint that we have. And now let's add a breakpoint in our code. Previously, we were only adding log information from our code, but there is some other breakpoint that you can add to your code. And that is basically calling the debugger in your code. So if you just write debugger in your code and go to the page, now you can see that we don't have any DOM breakpoints, we don't have any event listener breakpoints, and if I refresh the page, change the values for the products and calculate total, I can see that my code is stopping on the debugger section. This is another good way to stop the process and debug information, but from the source code. In order to stop your code whenever an error is happening on the page and log the information, you can enable the pause on uncaught exceptions. So let's go to the code and deliberately add an uncaught exception. Now in the code, I have added this not defined function whenever the quantity is more than 0. Okay, now if I go to the page and enable the pause on uncaught exceptions, let's refresh the page to see the updated code. And I have enabled pause on uncaught exceptions. When I change the quantities and click on calculate total, my debugger stops the code and the process and tells me that it has paused on this exception because this function doesn't exist. So this is really useful when you have an error in your file and you want to see what is happening. This will log the information and specifically the variables that you have set in watch section. And you can see the value and the assignments that are previously in the code. There is one more breakpoint that can be useful, and that is XHR or fetch breakpoints. So basically you can set this breakpoints that whenever is an XHR request, it'll pause the code, or you can add a condition that when the URL contains a specific word. Now let's go to a page that has some XHR requests. In this page, we have a fast cart WordPress plugin that whenever you add a product to the cart, it'll load a mini cart and will show you the information of the product just like this. So we know that this adds the product to the cart with an AJAX request, and as we can see and filter here, it adds it to the cart, and we can see the information of this requests. And I want to debug some information whenever this request is happening. I go to the sources panel and I don't need this file, so I close this one and I open the XHR fetch breakpoints. And I want to stop the process on any XHR or fetch request. I add a product to the cart and immediately it stops because this code has been paused on this fetch request. And I can see the URL of this request and also the call stack for this function. If I go step by step to see what is happening in this code, I will see the variables and the value for them. Well, I hope that this video has been useful for you and you are a little bit more comfortable using this debug features that you have on the sources panel, because it can be really useful to find the sources of the issues in your JavaScript files. And subscribe to the channel for more developer content.